Hello, Shannon here again. I want to thank you first off for giving me your time and attention. I would like to also thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing before we get started. For all my friends on Facebook and family, I would like to say hello. I've missed you and I love you, and I'm so thankful that you are here visiting with me today. And if you want to catch up sometime, give me a call. I'd appreciate it. With that being said, I would like to go over something that I said in the last video and kind of make it a little bit clearer, and that's concerning Jacob's trouble and the cutting off and the pruning that we all go through as both wheat and tares at our death. That's when the flesh is cast aside, that would be what's cut off, and then we have our spirit, which is pruned. I said that as individuals, whoever like Adam would be cut off. That's not true. If you go back to the garden, Adam, flesh is the only thing that gets death. We're all flesh, and when we die, that's the death. But the spirit of the flesh, the serpent, went to his belly. He didn't get death. He went to his belly, which is where the appetites of the flesh lie. And then Eve, in great pain and suffering, bears fruit. To bear also means to carry. She carries the load. So I wanted to make that clear before we get back into it. In Jacob's trouble, I said that if you're walking in love, that you would be taken care of. This is true. However, those of us who kept the first Passover by taking the blame, laying our lives down, taking the blame, which would correlate to eating the unleavened bread because Yeshua was in us, and if he's in us, then our flesh is his flesh, and we're eating the unleavened bread by taking the blame. This is what Eve did when she said the serpent deceived me. She's saying, I believed. Okay, so during Jacob's trouble, this is for those who are still like Adam, who are expecting others, those like Israel, to carry the burdens. Burdens they may have made themselves because they're not willing to do the work. So during Jacob's trouble, you're going to see all those people who are Israel rise up, the ones that have been carrying the load. You know, we're at that 120-year mark where God said he's only going to war with man, those like Adam, for 120 years, and that's it. Well, we're reaching that cutoff date. It's the God in us that's been warring with man and the God in man. And what we are all going to do is stand up and say, enough. We're not putting up with it anymore. We're not laying down our lives. Because we laid our lives down, it's our turn to pick them back up again. Now, if you are one that's equally yoked, you probably haven't experienced this in your home. Now, whether you've experienced it out in the world, the work or not, I don't know. You probably have already set good boundaries, and therefore this is not going to affect you as much. But for those people who have been like me, who have had issues with setting boundaries because I basically was like Benjamin and I had that cup put in my bag. I didn't steal it, it was put there, making me a slave to Joseph, who represents Jesus in the story. We didn't set boundaries, we laid it down. We gave all that we had to those asking or demanding. And so we have come to the point in the last 2 or 3 years where we are now learning how to set boundaries, because if you give to somebody who is a taker, they don't let you set boundaries. They will overstep until you set those boundaries. So during Jacob's trouble, it's all about Israel rising and saying, no more. It's our turn to live. And so those who have been like Adam are going to be in a struggle. They no longer get the favor. They don't get the favor from those who have been Israel. They also don't get God's favor. You see, the planets in the sky are working to change and do things in us. Their frequency, we're frequency. And the planets have changed the favor to the feminine, those like Israel. So when that literally takes effect, those like Adam will no longer get the favor. The favor will be turned over to those like Eve, whether we like it or not. So whatever you have been is what you're stuck with when this happens, until you decide that it's time to be circumcised in the heart. And I believe that will happen on the mass, in the masses. Instead of those like Adam being cut off, their heart will be cut. They will be circumcised in the heart at the end of that 7 years. And yes, I guess you can say I'm prophesying. I, you know, you can call it what you want. This is just what I see. It may or may not happen that way, but I have enough to show you that you may see it that way too. If not, that's okay because we're all individuals and we have the right to see it the way we want to. With that being said, I would like to go over the story of Judah and Tamar. And I'd like to show how this story and why this story is put in the middle of Joseph. This story, what I'm fixing to do is what would be considered Kabbalah to some. I'm going to go to the deepest layer of these stories and explain what it's really about. It's not really about the surface story. And you're going to understand that if you would just hear me out. Now, I warned you that I was going to go really deep, and deep is not for everybody. So if you decide you do not want to hear this, my feelings are not hurt. This is for those who really want a deeper understanding of the Word, to really know the actual truth. And when I'm done, if you don't see it that way, that's okay too. I'm just here to give you what I have learned through my studies and what I believe God has called me to share. So in the story of, first of all, let's go over the fact that we have firstborn and secondborn. The firstborn is the fleshly nature. The secondborn is the spiritual, who gets the inheritance. When you see three, the one in the middle is usually represented by Jesus because he represents both. Before death, he was considered wicked and he represented the fleshly nature. After death, he is considered righteous and represents the spiritual nature. And I say that to say that this pattern is also in many of the stories. And I'm going to show you where it is in the story of Tamar and Judah so that you understand exactly what this story really means and why it's interjected in between the story of Joseph. You have the older brothers. Joseph is the older of the younger brothers. No matter whether you're of the first part of the Bible and you're considered Jewish, there's still a firstborn and secondborn in each section of the book. There are those who live by the fleshly nature, those who live by the spiritual nature. So there is no one set person where all the people are of one. Both are in everybody because we all have been given a choice between blessings and curses. The curses that you choose are of the fleshly nature. The blessings are of the spiritual nature. And so I'm here to, again, set the record straight of what that really means. So in the story of Tamar, she has two husbands. The first husband is killed by God, considered wicked. Her second husband was considered wicked and died. Now, I want you to go back and read this story in Genesis 38 and read it well so that when I'm going over it here in a minute, you're going to be familiar with the story because I'm only going to hit the highlights and I'm paraphrasing and I'm going from memory because it's the deeper meaning that's more important to me and not the specifics in the story. I will go back over that later deeper when it's time to really teach every nitty-gritty thing in it. But right now I want to give you the highlights because it's extremely important for the times that we are in. And I'm going to show you how it is connected to John 16. Okay, so in the story, the first husband is considered wicked. That would be representation of death. The second husband is considered wicked too. Once he dies, though, he also represents the righteous. He is basically an archetype of Jesus in this story. And I will just say that in the story, he doesn't want to have a son to carry on the name of his brother, so he shoots his juice in the ground. Now, anytime you hear the word ground or earth, you can think Adam, because Adam is of the ground. So basically, he represents the second Adam, and we know that Jesus was the second Adam. So I say that to clarify that he is playing the part of Jesus in this story. Well, Judah, the father, is supposed to give Tamar the third son when he grows up, but he doesn't want to give him. He doesn't want to lose another son. Now remember that Judah in the story represents the fleshly nature. Judah's the fleshly, but in the story of Joseph, you have Jacob, who is sometimes Israel. He is a player in this particular story interjected because Israel is the father of spirit, while Judah is playing the father of flesh. These are parts being played to show a bigger story that we all know from the New Testament. If you do not know the New Testament, you are probably not going to understand what I'm fixing to explain. You have to have an understanding of the basics of the New Testament and who Yeshua Jesus is. Okay, so because Judah does not want to give Tamar his third son, she basically, it says she dresses as a prostitute. She wore a veil. She disguised herself. She meets him when he's going to shear sheep, which basically is the same thing as uncovering the sheep, something that an unbelieving person would do. Judah represents the unbelievers, the ones who did not receive Yeshua, Jesus. Okay, he basically sleeps with her. He gives her a signet ring, a cord, the seal, um, the staff, which these items all represent something. And so when he comes back to find her, they basically say there is no prostitute. Let me just remind you, just because you dress as a prostitute or someone thinks you're a prostitute does not mean that you are a prostitute. And I say that because this also correlates to the United States. Everybody thinks we're the prostitute. We physically look like the prostitute, but spiritually, we are the country that loves everybody the most. We have our issues, and yes, there's both firstborn and secondborn in this country, but this country is the country considered Egypt that Joseph, who plays the part of Yeshua, is over. And we basically have based all of our things in the United States on Jesus from the beginning. Now, yes, like I said, there's problems. These are highlights, these are basics. I don't want to get into the details. I'm just showing you what characters are being played by who and what is the real meaning of this story. What does it really mean for us? Because there is a deep meaning to this. She gets pregnant. Judah finds out she's pregnant and he wants to have her killed, burned. Anytime you see fire, it represents judgment. So what does she do? She tells him that the person that owns these items is the father of her baby. Let me back up for a minute. He doesn't want to give his third son. If you go back to the story where Israel, Jacob, doesn't want to give Benjamin to go with the older brothers to see Joseph, eventually he operates courageously and sends him, and he becomes Israel. That's a third son too. You've got the older sons, and then you've got Jesus in the middle, who is the older of the younger, but he represents both the older and the younger. And so Benjamin would be a representation of the third son. Now, if you look at death, burial, and resurrection, the third is allowed to live. He's not supposed to have to die. I want you to pay attention that Israel, Jacob, represents the spiritual in the name Israel, but Judah represents the physical. He's not going to give Tamar his physical son, yet Israel agrees to send Benjamin, who represents the spiritual. Okay, this is very important because in this story, when Tamar gives all these items over to Judah, he tells her, and basically he's embarrassed and he doesn't want to incriminate himself. He tells her that she is more righteous than he, and they never got together again. But I want to remind you that if you have the Son, you're one with the Father. And that is what this story is all about, because these items that Tamar was given, the signet ring, I'm looking at my notes, it's the ring of a king. In the garden, you have a king and a ruler. Adam was the ruler, but Eve was the king. The one who is spiritual is the real king. Okay, the cord represents coverings. He's giving her a covering. The staff represents the commandments. So, what I'm telling you is that she is the representation of the third. She is the picture of the bridegroom. And just like the story of Joseph is prophetic to Jesus, the story of Tamar is prophetic to a second coming. God is not sending a man, because if it's a man in the picture of a husband, he will have to die. He's sending a woman because she gets life, but she has the male, the spiritual within her. And how does this correlate to John 16? In John 16, Jesus says, I have to go so the Holy Spirit, which is Ruach HaKodesh in Hebrew, can come and explain all things. Ruach HaKodesh is feminine. And in the translation it says, he, when it should have said she, will come and explain all things. She will testify to what she hears. She will testify that men do not believe in me. Those like Adam did not believe in the God in Eve. Jesus. Number 2, I am righteous and I've gone to the Father. He is not coming back the way we were all trained that he was coming back. He is coming back in spirit, in a different flesh, a female flesh. And number 3, the enemy has already been condemned. The enemy equates to the fleshly nature, and flesh has been condemned to go back to the earth. So what I'm telling you is that the story of Tamar is interjected into the story of Joseph to create a picture of the first, second, and third death, burial, resurrection, to show who Tamar represents. Her name means fruit. She goes on to have 2 children, the 2 children that she was impregnated with by the father. If you have the son, you have the father. And Perez means to burst forth, because actually Zerah, the second, his name means glowing or shining, as in the spiritual nature. But he comes out first. They tie a red string, the red representing his suffering, because he's the second born who will actually get the inheritance. But because he came out first in this story, it is a representation that he really is the firstborn. The second born in the garden really is the firstborn from heaven, the Spirit. I knew you before you were in the womb means that your spirit existed before your flesh. So the second born is a representation of the spiritual, and it's all about the spiritual nature, not the flesh. The flesh came second. We were spiritual beings first. On earth, the natural came first and then the spiritual. But Jesus said the first will be last and the last will be first. Now, Eve created the seed, Jesus. She came first. The first will be last, the last will be first. This person coming, I know that John 16, a lot of people think that was just at Pentecost, and it was at Pentecost, but it's also prophetic. Why? Because he says that he, which it should be she, will testify to what he hears. Flesh hears, spirit knows. Only flesh can testify to what it hears. Spirit is going to tell you what it knows. It has to be a person that he is speaking about, not just spirit. Now, you can agree or disagree. It really doesn't matter to me. I'm presenting to you information that I know God gave me. If you receive it, I'm blessed, because that is the reason I'm doing this, is to give you what I know. But it really is not about religion. It never has been. It's about our relationship. It's about the fleshly nature versus the spiritual nature. Jews and Christians are an archetype of both. But just because you're a Jew does not mean you're an unbeliever. And just because you say you're Christian does not mean you're Christian. The question is, how do you walk? Do you have the staff? Do you have the signet ring? He's going to offer the goat too, which is the scapegoat. And our flesh is literally the scapegoat, because our flesh without the spirit in it can do nothing. So when it dies, what's running it, the driver, that would be our spirit, is still alive. It goes on to transform into something bigger and better because it's pruned. So that's the immortality that we would like to put on. So we have to go from an Adam to an Eve, from a Jacob to an Israel, from a Judah to an Israel. And when the two sticks, Judah and Israel, become one, it's language of marriage. But guess whose name is blotted out like Haman's in the story of Esther? Judah, because Israel was the real husband. She laid her life down and took the blame. And I'm telling you, these videos are about the redemption of Israel. And I'm explaining to you who Israel is. I'm explaining to you the deeper things in the Bible so that you can understand that the Bible is the truth. But our perceptions of it have not been 100% correct. We have not been passed down the truth about what it means. And there's a difference between it not being correct and us not having a correct perception of it. I kind of summed that up really quick. I'm trying to keep my videos to a minimum. Of course, I'm going to go back and really describe these things a lot deeper and slower for those that are not getting it. But this story of Tamar and Judah is extremely important because just like Joseph was a prophetic story of Jesus, Tamar is a prophetic story of the Holy Spirit who's coming in flesh to explain all things. If a man was to come, he'd have to die because he'd be a picture of the husband. It's called a bridegroom for a reason. Bride on the outside, which is female, groom on the inside, the spirit, which is male. With that being said, I thank you again for being here, watching my video, and liking, sharing, and subscribing. And I wish you guys an abundance of blessings.